Hello, everybody. We are starting work tonight on Chapter 4. The topic for Chapter 4, as you see on the screen, is models. And models, of course, is the M part of the MVC, and clearly a real important component to this architecture. And I'm just kind of going to backtrack a little bit here because we were having this discussion in class just before we began. And basically, I was looking back on Chapter 3 and looking at, are there actual steps to complete in Chapter 3? And there are actually a few, and we didn't actually do any of them in class. And I will be perhaps adding a token assignment for Chapter 3. I'm really kind of struggling with that right now in terms of like how relevant is it really? Because it really is demonstrating more how views work and the syntax for Razor as opposed to actually doing any of our work right now, because we don't have data to pull from to create an application. So if you don't have that, that's why they have you install that rocks package using NuGet to pull some data in so you can see what it does. Now I'm going to begin my discussion now on Chapter 4, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit here so you can see what the object is. And the first thing we're going to talk about is really kind of what models are. I know we mentioned that a little bit last week, and how it's going to apply this particular application. We're also going to look at the process of what we call scaffolding. And scaffolding is a way to really quickly build a framework to get work done. And it gives you a lot of components with it depending on the selections that you make. And then also we are going to look at how to actually modify certain contents within our models, and then also talk about this concept called model binding, mostly through demonstration. Now, the author will remind you at the beginning of every chapter that you can actually go to his website and download the code for the chapters, so you have a starting point, both for this chapter and any of the previous chapters. So, don't hesitate to look at that. I don't want you to do your work that way. It's not going to teach you anything. The procedural part of like putting this together is really kind of what it's all about, frankly. All right, so let's take a look at this whole concept of, this thing called a model. And the author here has a little snippet. I'm just going to read it to you. It says, the word model in software development is overloaded to cover hundreds of different concepts, and it's true. But we're working with MVC. So inside of MVC, it refers to the structure of our data, basically, is the way that I like to think of it. It does not necessarily mean it is the data. And you need to make that a real distinction. So that's kind of an important thing. But very often when we're working with models, we might be tying into some sort of a data store, whether it's a text file, JSON data, a database, a flat file. It could be any number of different things. But whenever we're working with data, and we're usually thinking of data in the structure of a table, where there's data types, column headers, multiple records of entry for each row that's unique to a specific entity. And when we're dealing with data like that, we often do database-like operations, which is we might just want to retrieve the data and look at it, or we might want to create the data, or we might want to change it, or just get rid of it, right? All the basic database operations, all the CRUD operations: create, retrieve, update, and destroy. All right, and the author does talk about that. Now, one thing that we will do here, and he points out, is we will be creating models to model the data that we need for our application. So he points out the fact that we're going to have a shopping cart, right? So if you have a shopping cart, well, that's kind of its own whole data structure in itself. We are going to be selling music, so music falls into categories like genres, and it also will have specific pieces of music that we're selling, usually that are attributed to some sort of an album. And we're also going to have users that are signed up, and that information is stored too. So you can very quickly see how you're going to build up a bunch of different types of data structures that are related to an application. And the thing that was really cool about working with MVC, and really I think it's kind of the magic behind MVC in a lot of ways, is that when we do have a data source, how the MVC architecture through this process called scaffolding, with literally the click of a few mouse presses or buttons and selections, generates this whole structure that does a lot of those operations that we like automatically. And I think that's just kind of an amazing thing, really. All right, so as we move on to go back to creating this MVC Music Store, we are going to be, as the author indicates right here, going back to where we left off in Chapter 2. Kind of indicating that Chapter 3 was there wasn't really a lot of stuff going on there that we're building, but more demonstration and concepts. And he's saying here, for the simplicity of it all, we're going to create a brand new application. Okay, so we're starting from scratch again. That might seem a little redundant, but if you think about the steps we did in the first couple chapters, we really didn't perform a lot of actions, really learning more about the concept, and really going through the process of creating this from scratch isn't a bad thing anyhow. What you might want to do is take that application that you've already built and maybe either rename it or move it somewhere else, because what I'm noticing here that he's going to end up calling the project MVC Music Store, and if I remember right in my Visual Studio, I already called it that. So that might create some issues. And then I don't know if the steps he's going to put forth in this chapter are going to be different than the steps that we've already done, causing some, various issues. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take that MVC Music Store wherever I stored it, and it looks like I put it in my OneDrive. So I'm going to pull up my file window here. Of course, it comes up on the second screen, and that's actually okay for right now, because I put it in a weird folder, and if you can see here with 5 underscores at the beginning of the name. So I did that on purpose so that it would come up to the top of my OneDrive when I'm looking for it. So I'm going to go ahead and just do the project, and obviously I'm just going to put it in a different folder. So my old work is still there, not a big deal. It's a different folder. Give it the same name. It really shouldn't cause any problems. All right, let's jump back over to the book here and start following the instructions. I am going to pull the book off to my second screen. So if you see it disappear, I might pull it back over from time to time. It kind of depends on what I'll be doing here. All right, so we are now at the bottom of page 76 in Chapter 4. And there's a command there that says start by using the File New Project command and create an ASP.NET web application like he demonstrates here. Now remember, he's using a different version than we are, but that's really irrelevant. The screen should be relatively the same. So we will create a new project from the file menu. So go ahead and do that. We are going to be working under the Visual C# area in the web folder. And here is where we already have some differences, right? Which one do I choose? Because now we have ASP.NET Core application. And notice, I'm reading the description here, folks. It says project templates for creating ASP.NET Core applications for Windows, Linux, and Mac OS using .NET Core or .NET Framework. Is that a maybe? What do you guys think? I say it's a maybe. What about this one? ASP.NET Web Application, .NET Framework, blah, 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 blah. You can create ASP.NET Web Forms, MVC, right? Hint, hint, hint. That's the one we want. So that's the one we're going to choose. Resumed. Okay, so go ahead and make that choice. And let's be careful about how we name this. He does want us to name it MVC. Notice V and C are lowercase, M is capital, and store, the S is capital. Now, I'm following exactly what he's doing, really for the reason that if we do get to the point where we have to borrow from his code, like if we have problems or we're looking for examples, the naming of the project creates our root namespace. And you're going to learn namespaces are pretty critical with these C# based projects. And if you start naming it something different, and in the past, when I've taught this to our SharePoint groups, I would do that thinking I was all clever, and then every time I went to fix something or figure something out, I was like, oh yeah, that's right, I did it differently. So when I look at the examples, I had a hard time tracing it down. So this time I'm going to follow it to the letter as much as I can. I know that I've been having issues with storing the stuff in weird locations, so it is going into my OneDrive. I am going to create a new folder, just 2 underscores on this one, and I'm going to name it MVC Music Store with the same case structure. Make sure that name is locked in, and then I'm going to select that folder. Okay, so that's going to store my solution there and my project there. Now, typically I work with Google Drive because we've switched to that Google Drive file stream. You guys heard all about it in the last videos. Yeah, it hasn't been working nicely with a lot of this .NET stuff, so I'm leaving it alone. And we are going to create a directory for the solution. We'll just go with the defaults. Go ahead and click OK once you get to that point. All right. Now you get the MVC option listing here, and really it's an option for all the different types of applications that you can do with .NET. And we are going to choose MVC, obviously. And I do have a highlight in my book here where I like totally highlight all the Azure stuff, which is kind of interesting. But that is not appearing on my screen, and that might be because of some of the other choices. Now, if you remember from the earlier chapters, the author does want it to add unit testing stuff, so just go ahead and click that box. And do we want to put in an authentication at this point is my next question. All right, as I look at the book real carefully here, and notice I'm going to pull this screen back over. See what it says right here? Yeah. So it does tell us to actually make a choice. So if you're not really careful about looking at it, it's easy to miss, like basically I just did. So I am going to make sure that we choose individual user accounts. And I am being cautious about this because this is a big project that we're building. It's not like, one chapter and we're done. It's a pretty holistic project, so we make the wrong choices here, and then it kind of snowballs down into problems later. All right, so individual user accounts, we're adding our unit tests. I think all the selections are okay, so I'm clicking OK. And it's going to go ahead, as we've done in the past, and kind of build out all the different things that we need. So let's go ahead and let that do the work. Now, on the next page here, or actually on page 77, if you start reading the text, he's going through and he's talking about all the different things that are being created. And what he's pointing out mostly in the first paragraph is that we do have some models that actually pre-exist in our folders here. And these have to do with account management, obviously, and some of the other pre-built things. There's no real concern right now about working with these. We'll deal with them when we have to. But if you remember when we build this out, it does make this complete registration and login system for us automatically. And that is enabled basically by these models. Okay, so if you want to poke around and look, go for it. The one thing that I'm noticing, though, in the book, he's showing that his framework built 2 models, which I do have, but I have an additional one, which is the manage view models, and that must be basically a ramp-up of the technology. I'm not worried about it being different. In fact, I guess in some ways I'm kind of expecting that that's going to be the case. All right. Now, we're going to sell music, So if we're going to sell music, we usually sell that in the form of like a CD or what we used to call in the old days albums. In fact, they're kind of making a comeback, which is kind of neat. I went to Fry's Electronic down in Chicago a while ago, and they have a vinyl section where they sell vinyl records again. And we went around the holidays, and they had, I don't know, maybe like 50 titles, and then we went again, and they have like maybe 3 or 4 times that much. So it must really be kind of coming back. So we will call them albums. All right, but it says at the bottom of page 77, it says to add a new album class to the models folder, right-click the models folder, and I'm doing it right now. And this isn't a numbered step, so this is one of those spots where the book's kind of weird, I think. So this is where we have to be really careful as we read through. And then we're going to choose add, and then we're going to add a class. And you see class is listed right at the bottom. And they want us to name the class album. So I'm just going to title it album. And notice it is with a capital A. Go ahead and click add. And then it just drops the file right in. All right, and the last part of the instruction at the bottom of page 77 says that you should open up the album class, which it does automatically, and we're leaving all the namespace stuff intact for right now. And you know, when I was talking about that namespace stuff, you know, this is why it's important to name it exactly what he does, because that gets embedded into all the project structure instead of all the class names. So what we're going to do here is we're going to leave all that stuff intact, but we're going to add some content to the middle of the album class, and basically a combination of various variables. And so I'm going to just grab them right from our textbook and just copy paste them in. Yes, you can do that. That is if you have a PDF of this. And here's right now where I'm already concerned about the chapter 3 stuff. Now he's telling us that we're starting from scratch, but one thing that he did do in the chapter 3 stuff by pulling in those NuGet libraries is he did pull in some of this information in a pre-built structure. You notice how genre and artist are underlining red? And then right away in the output window at the bottom, it's showing us errors. And what's the error saying? It says, the type or namespace genre cannot be found. Are you missing a directive or an assembly reference? Well, sure we are, because really what we're doing here is we're declaring our own data type, right? So did we do that yet? No. So it's okay that it's underlined, so don't freak out. And of course, my students point out to me what I can't obviously read on the screen. It says, this class won't compile yet because genre and artist classes referenced in the last 2 properties haven't been defined yet. That's okay, we'll do those next. Thank you, author. So I'm kind of like stating the obvious is what I'm doing. I'm being clever, at least I think I am. But if you guys like recognize some of these declarations, we're creating data types, and in the C# language, when I put in there a private or a public variable declaration instead of a class, we're declaring the data type, but then you notice after we declare it and name it, in the curly brackets how they have get and set. In C#, what's really cool about C#, unlike Java, is when you create a data type in a class, one that's not going to be one to execute code, but one that's going to hold data or be used for its methods, those are the getters and setters. I don't have to go down and write separate methods. They're just automatically created by just saying get and set. Right? So if you understand your Java, and I know at least one of you were in my Java class just an hour ago, you appreciate this because it's really kind of a cool shortcut in C#. Okay, moving on through page 78 now, and of course, you know, I'm reading the author. He must think exactly like me, in a way, or maybe I've like looked at this book too much. But he talks about it right afterwards as well, you know, because I feel the obligation to kind of explain what's going on as it's happening. All right. All right. So another thing that you think about when you get an album, right, a record album, that record album is created by some sort of a musical artist, whether it's a group or an individual or whatever, right? So in order to kind of build our application, another data model that we need to throw in there is one for artists. So let's go ahead and do that as well. So at the top of page 79, he's asking us to add an artist class to the models folder. So same procedure, just right click and add, and you can either find it right at the bottom of the list here, which is what I'm going to do, or you can choose new item and search for it. It just depends on if it comes up or not. This one will be called artist with the capital A. Now, if I have any of you people that are listening to this video that also happen to take my Ruby on Rails class, when you do the Ruby version of MVC using that Rails framework, they have a whole naming convention for models and classes and data with the capital letters actually having special meaning. And I don't know if that really extends into this language or not. I don't recall off the top of my head. But wherever he's using a capital letter, make sure that you follow along. Once again, if you do have to pull from his code, you can make sure it's congruent. All right, so go ahead and click Add. Same routine here. We're going to add a couple of variables with getters and setters inside there. You can pull those right from the book. Either type them in or paste them in. Save yourself some time. And make sure you're saving all this stuff. So go ahead and hit a save all once in a while. The author from there, after he talks about this on page 79 near the top, he goes into a little bit of a talk about comparing our artist class and the album class. And now, when you think about, like, you buy an album and an artist has created it, right? And if you look at, like, the data fields that we've created for album, okay, so there's album ID, genre ID, artist ID, right? Okay, not sure why you need IDs, but we got title, price, album art, genre, and artist. But why do we use ID fields? Well, if you guys took a database class, which, God, I hope you did, right, before you're in this class, because really you shouldn't be here if you didn't, you'll know that this is very quickly pointing to the fact that database structures, when they're done right, will usually have ID fields to uniquely identify the record. So instead of, like, let's say I have the Pink Floyd album Dark Side of the Moon, right? So the artist is Pink Floyd and the album is Dark Side of the Moon. But in my database, I'm going to have an ID field that might be a number that will allow me to identify that record. And just like the actual album manufacturers, in fact, all albums, if you ever looked at an old record album or CD or cassette, and probably CDs and DVDs, will have the title, artist, and title, and then you'll usually see a little code. It'll be like DVD 4239 or something like that. And that's the unique ID number for that record label for that particular product. It's kind of like a UPC code, but it's unique. And the whole point is that when we work with databases and we start to take all these models, we're really tying a bunch of data together. And those are the ID fields are the ones that form the links between the different tables, so we know that we're associating the things correctly. So that's why when we look at the artist category, the only thing in here is the artist name, right? And then the artist ID. So then when we're trying to tie our album back to the artist, we're not going to type in Pink Floyd, we're going to type in the artist ID, and that's what's going to link them together, okay? So this has to do with all these concepts of, like, primary keys and foreign keys, and really in this relationship, what we're looking at is the ID fields will often be foreign keys, often that will be required in order to pull the information together. Because no album can really exist without having an artist that created it. Okay. All right, next step, bottom of page 79, if you're reading ahead. We are also going to create a genre class in the models folder. So let's right-click once again, add a class, and this will be called genre. It's not plural, it's a singular. capital G, go ahead and click Add. Once again, we're going to bring in the data fields, and that's either the public or private variables that are being used in the application. You guys should be familiar with that terminology from learning object-oriented programming, right? So you're going to see that we have the genre ID. So all the classes that we're building here that are data models, all of them are going to have an ID field. And that's just basically, folks, that's just good database design, right? Every genre will have a name, a description, and then a list. And notice it is a list of albums. And that's a type of array structure. It's an array list that you may have learned about in your other programming languages. But whenever you see those brackets in there like that, it's really a type of array. So what they're telling you is that they're going to associate all these different albums with the particular genre through an array structure. All of them have getters and setters. All right. Some of you might be asking what this little moniker means. Has anybody been wondering that? Right? And what he does, author, that is, at the top of page 80, he says, we're going to discuss that later. And it really is kind of a newer convention that we're seeing in C# quite a bit. But for right now, you really don't need to worry your head about it too much. Just do what they say, and it should work just fine. One thing I do want you to look at, remember when we saved this one, if you didn't save it already, click Control-S. Remember when we were first working with the album class, how genre and artist were underlining? Right? And really what's happening here is we were creating our own data type or our own class type that now, because genre and artist exist, these are no longer underlined, so the error went away. All right, next step is he wants us to actually do a build of the application. So if you guys haven't done that process in Visual Studio before, doing a build is basically the process of debugging. Now, most of you should realize that it was doing it on the fly anyhow as we were creating the code, even before we were saving it. But what it does is basically it compiles the code and makes sure there's no mistakes. So go ahead and click on the root of the project over here in Solution Explorer, do a right click, and just do a build. All right? And I want you to get into the habit of doing this, especially if you run into issues. All right? And you can see that it's not throwing any errors. It says build, 1 succeeded, 0 failed, 0 up to date, 0 skipped. We're okay, is basically what that's telling us. But one habit that you'll get into, especially when you're working with data models that are tying to real tangible data, and for any reason that data changes or any of your model structures change, guess what you have to do? Very often, especially when you tie to a database, you're going to find yourself coming up here and either doing a clean, which kind of blows a lot of stuff out of memory, and then a build. Or they have this one option here that's clean, or it's called rebuild. In some IDEs, they say clean and rebuild, or clean and build, or something like that. But rebuild basically cleans first and then builds. So my habit typically is, if I'm having some sort of issue in any IDE, and I think that things are okay, but something's going on, that's one of my first go-tos for solving all sorts of issues. So if something's going on, I do that first, and then, if there's still a problem, then I know it's probably actually a problem, as opposed to being some remnants in memory that are kind of throwing me off. Okay, so no harm done if you do that from time to time. But if stuff is underlined before you're doing it, it's probably going to throw an error anyhow. And that's the power of working with something like Visual Studio. The other really important part of that build process is the second bullet that he points out here at the top of page 80 it is. He says, not only is it important for solving issues and making sure you don't have syntax problems, but basically, if you're working with data models and you want to use the scaffolding feature, which you can see as our next topic, which builds out a lot of structures automatically, if you don't have these components compiled in the code, when you go to run the scaffolding, it will overlook the fact that those are there and not build them into the structure. So if you wanted to have like a database control over the artists and you didn't like pre-compile the code, you go to do the scaffolding and it just skips it. And all of a sudden you're wondering, but I did everything just the way the book did, and, you know, and it's not working. That's why. Okay. So I think that's really good that he points that out. In the older version of the text, I'm not sure that he does that. And then you end up like kind of figuring it out the hard way. And what I find really fascinating about the fact that we're building this music store tutorial thing, and for those of you that are, you know, all over it, and I know when I put these videos together for the music store that I get a lot of like just generic web traffic hitting it. And my previous batch of videos was built on MVC3, and here I am on MVC5. And then all of a sudden you start getting comments on the videos. Well, oh yeah, if you're working with this version, you got to do that, and you got to do that, you know. And people like get pretty active on talking about it. So sometimes I think that's pretty helpful. But we are doing MVC5 here, folks. So those of you that are watching the video, just jump in midstream. Just keep that in mind. All right, so we're going to move on now to the concept of scaffolding and what it is. All right. In general, and I'll just pull this back over, scaffolding can kind of be summarized as this. Once you have your data structures in place, so we're talking about our models. We've defined the basic structure of our data. You know, the fields that go in, the getters, the setters, all that stuff. When I do the scaffolding and I want to create database controls over it, create, retrieve, update, and destroy, this tool will automatically generate those structures for manipulating those components with a click of a button, instead of you sitting there coding all of those interactions. Now, those of you that are concurrently in my Java 2 class, which is kind of interesting, and I'm looking at you, sir. When you get to the Java 2 class, really it's better to take that one well before you take this one. But we get to a part where we actually do database interactions, and we manually create those capabilities. And then when you do that manually, and then you see how this works, you're like, oh my God, why don't I always do this? Well, that's the whole point of MVC. Yeah, you should. So remember that acronym, CRUD. And he does make a little point here. He says, don't expect it to build your whole application. No, but it gets you a large portion of the way there with that underlying infrastructure. And more importantly, it works, right? For those of you that do it like in the Java language where we create those things manually, you should recall that like one comma out of place, or the wrong, like a single quote instead of a double quote, and all of a sudden your whole SQL statement falls apart, and you're kind of like pulling your hair out for hours trying to like fix one little problem, where here it's just done. All right. Okay, so the next thing that he starts to talk about is when we do pull up the scaffolding interface, and we'll be presented with a number of different options. There are different approaches you can use. So you can actually, if you wanted, you could build these things yourself. I mean, that is entirely possible, but he also makes note of the fact that there are like third-party tools out there that you can pull in that will work with these templates. All right. One thing that's really important with these templates, and I guess I should bring this back over on the screen to show you where I'm at. So he's talking about the different options that we'll have for scaffolding, and very briefly explains what each one of them do. But notice that the very bottom one is all based on this thing called Entity Framework. And that's a real important one, especially moving into the future. So you'll find that a lot of people who are doing modern MVC app development will use this approach very often. There are some of these, the one with the API version, the web API version, where we will talk about that technology later on, that has its own scaffolding approach in and of itself. He then goes into this whole talk here about how entity framework and scaffolding work together. And what's really important about entity framework is that it is basically built upon this whole technology called ORM, and you can see the acronym stands for Object Relational Mapping. And it is really a key technology in not only this, in Microsoft-based applications, but really in a lot of different types of modern application development. If you guys happen to take the Intro to Programming Database course, if you're in the software program or the older version of the web program, you may have also learned about this link query structure, which is a kind of a different type of way to write database statements, and that all kind of works intertwined in this framework in the .NET arena. All right. Reading on and just really trying to make sense of this, and this is kind of this age-old argument that kind of comes with this form of development. And let me bump up the screen size here. And you'll notice it says Entity Framework supports a database first, model first, and code first styles of development. So that implies that there's different approaches to building applications that are data reliant, right? And people who are database centric, that are DBAs and admins, and some of those people will say it's much more important to build the database first and get all that stuff in there and structure it before we go building our application. Okay, the model first approach is an approach where we are building the data structures, and it's kind of what we are doing, right? We are building the classes. Right? No data, we're not tying into a database, but we're building the framework in the code that's going to hold the stuff that the data is going to do, right? And then we have the code first approach where we're coding with a dependency to pull in certain information that may or may not exist, okay? And then as an afterthought, we build the data. That's kind of weird, right? So why would you have these different approaches? And if you are, like I said, if you're a database person, you're always going to lean towards the first option. But the MVC approach does not necessarily require that you have the database first. This is the interesting part of it. You can set up the data models and then feed in information from text files and build your application, and in some cases that's adequate. Then knowing that because your application is MVC and it is driven by data, okay, that was strange. Hopefully it's not an active shooter. Then what you're doing is you're using the application itself to help generate the data. So that's kind of weird, right? So application comes first. It's kind of like a chicken and an egg thing, and there's really no right or wrong answer. It's kind of approach. Okay, so he goes into a retort here about all these different approaches. Now, really, what I would say is, if you are really confused about databases and you haven't learned about them yet, you might want to read up on it. But that is a really important concept because we use a lot of database-like approaches for doing these things. Now, there's going to be times where we are going to be building applications, and certainly when you go out into the field, where you'll be asked to build an application that attaches to something that pre-exists. Absolutely. And then the converse might happen where, as a coder, you're building the application and you're imagining the data that you'll need and how it'll interrelate, and you build it into the class files just like we just did, with the understanding of how databases work, and you build your data models according to those same principles. There's data types, there's links together, things are separated into logical tables so you don't have to repeat information. So all those same types of principles apply. The thing that's kind of interesting here is he goes into this DB context class, which is really all about data that is kind of derived from a source. So in that case, then you're going to find yourself using that link language that you may or may not have learned, and it's really not that big of a deal. But basically, once you have the database created, It just allows you to use a SQL-like language to extract data, place it into certain sorts, and then display certain aspects of the data depending on what you're choosing. All right, so he goes pretty deep into this, but we want to get to the part where we're actually doing something. All right, so here we are on page 85, once again moving off to the other screen here. Okay. He says, okay, we've covered all necessary theory, and folks, I am expecting that you read that stuff, not just listen to me like gloss over it. And there is a reason why we do ask you to do database classes first, so that, you know, I think it helps, basically. All right, so our step one here now is we're going to actually do the scaffolding by virtue of doing some work in the controllers folder. So I'm going to go to the controllers folder. I'm actually going to expand it so I see what's in there. And if you guys notice here, we have an account controller, a home controller, and a manage controller. Those are pre-built. Okay. He does want us to go ahead and right-click that controllers folder, just like we did with the models folder, and choose add, and then we're going to add a controller. Now you'll find that by default at the top here, because we're on the controllers folder and we're in an MVC application, so it makes a whole lot of sense. And then we're going to be presented with a number of selections, including some of the ones that he mentioned here in the book. You will also notice that if you're using a more modern version Visual Studio, which I am, I actually have one extra web API type here, which I think is kind of interesting. But the one he wants us to select is MVC5 controller with views using Entity Framework. And you know, don't hesitate to read the stuff on the side here too. It says an MVC controller with actions and razor views to create, read, update, and delete, and list entities from an Entity Framework data context. Notice it does not say database, right? Because really where the data comes from is kind of irrelevant as long as you have it. Right. So once you've made that choice, go ahead and click add. All right. Now you get the subsequent box, and here we have to put in a number of different things. First thing it says in step number 3, change the controller name and that would be down here. I'm not saying that I have to actually change mine. Are you guys having to change yours? I'm not changing mine, so all right. But we do want to type in Store Manager Controller. Store Manager Controller, and be very careful to make sure the case is exact like they're doing it in the book. Try to match it if at all possible. Now, interestingly, you know, a hush comes over the class and kind of over myself here as we're doing this, because I'm looking at the book and scrolling down, and, you know, he shows a screenshot of what we're supposed to do. And I'm noticing here that, you know, these interfaces look different, right? My controller name's at the bottom. That's why I was like doing kind of a little bit of a change here. But really all the same stuff is still present. All right, so I want to just make sure that things pop up correctly. And the one thing that we want to do for the model class, you see there's a drop down. And what we're hoping to find here is what? I think album is, yeah, album.musicstore.mvc.models, okay? But you notice there's a bunch of other pre-built structures that you can throw in here. Are you guys noticing that? Do you know where it's pulling all these things from? These are already included in our project. Where are they coming from? From that automatic registration system. So pre-built structures, but we are choosing the one that we're creating. You'll notice that the other classes that we created, by virtue of the fact that we compiled our code, artist is here, genre is here, right? All three of the ones that we created. So for the first one, we do want to choose album. There's no selection needed for data context class. And we're not worried about async controllers, but we do want to generate views, reference script libraries, and use a layout page. But it says leave empty if it is set in a Razor view start file, which is going to be what we're doing. Now, if for any reason you cannot find this entry, cancel out, come up here, right-click, and do a build, right? And I would actually suggest rebuild at this point, which does a clean and a build in the same step. So that's going to help in terms of making sure that this appears, because otherwise if you don't compile, it won't read the classes you created and it won't offer them up in the dialogues. All right, I'm reading now that in step number 4, very bottom of page 86, he says, click the new data context button. Now, if you're wondering where that is, that's this one with the big plus sign. And that's going to bring up a separate dialog. And it just has one thing that you need to put in there, and that basically allows you to enter the name of the class you'll use to access the database, including the namespace for the class. It says name your context, and this is step 5 now, Music Store DB. So the part that's highlighted is what we want. So just type, in other words, don't worry about like highlighting any of that, just type Music Store DB, just like that. And I believe we need the dot there. And folks, I'm going to correct what I just said about that, putting the dot in there. Don't put the dot in there. People are noticing in the book the word context is excluded, right? So my gut feeling on this is we leave context in there. But frankly, I'm not really sure. So I'm just going to be brave, and I'm just going to type Music Store DB, just like that. And I don't know if he has a little snippet about leaving the word context in there or not. But because he's doing it that way, I think I'm just going to follow along with him and remove context. All right? So if we fail, worst thing that's going to happen is we come back and recreate it. Right? Yeah. Yeah, that's my feeling too. At first I thought there was a dot there, so in that case it's like a namespace structure that should be there, but I'm thinking it's just text. So yeah, I think that's a wise move there. So go ahead and click add. All right, and then you can see it dropped it in to the application. And then he's asking that we verify that we match up with number 6, which is figure 4.7, that all the fields are the same. Remember, the big difference here is Visual Studio 2017 puts a controller name at the bottom of the screen. Okay. Now we're going to be brave, and we're going to click the Add button. And what happens then is now we're triggering the scaffolding. So I'm going to click Add, and you can see it's not an instantaneous process because it's actually doing a lot of work in the background. And what we're going to do as soon as it's done is actually take a look at what it's created. All right, so now that our scaffolding is complete, it's kind of time to look at the results. Now, after it executes, we were working with creating the Store Manager controller, which is the file that pops up. And I mean, if you want, you can go ahead and kind of scroll through it and look at the stuff it puts in there. And it really creates a lot of things automatically. We didn't code any of this, right? Not at all. A lot of pretty complex little interactions there, including like anti-hacking code for that matter. But what the book wants to point out to you is we really kind of created a whole bunch of different things, not just that store manager controller. The first thing you should notice is that, when you start to actually expand the little class here in Solution Explorer, how it takes all the different methods and the database and all those different things and breaks them down as objects. So keep in mind, Solution Explorer is not a file manager, it's a package manager. So you're not really expecting to see files there, but you do see components of the class that you've built. What they do want you to do, though, is go ahead and take a look at some of the other stuff that it created. So one thing that it created in particular is if you go to your models folder here, and then you'll see at the bottom here, all of a sudden we have a new model for Music Store DB.cs, right? We didn't code that. That was a result of the scaffolding. So really what we did here, folks, is we built class models, right? We wrote the code first. We ran the scaffolding. It recognized all the different connections that we had built in those files, those 3 model files, and it built a database structure for us. In fact, if you look in here, it not only recognized, we put in just albums, right? But it recognized that there's connection to artists and genres, and then put in the getters and the setters relative to the database structure itself. That's pretty amazing, actually, right? Instead of coding it yourself. So it built that file, which is pretty helpful.
Does it actually create
Getting to that. That's the next logical question. It's like, did it really create a database? Well, I'm not really sure, right? This should be your answer. But actually what it does is the way that it operates, and I think that might even be the next topic in the book here. So, all right, well, the next topic in the book is they actually want us to look at the store manager controller, which is what we were looking at already, and look at some of the things inside of it. So you'll notice that it is pulling from the database, but it really points you on page 89 in listing 4.5 to look at some of the code. And just for example, this very first snippet of code, because we use albums to do our scaffolding, it pulls from the database the albums, and it reads all the album artists, and then does the special command called an include that brings up this table. There's a gray box table at the bottom of 80 that goes on to page 90 that talks about what the author calls an eager loading strategy, right? One way to pull in album information is that we can run a separate query, like in a loop, for example, and pull back each album one by one, right? Not very efficient for a web application if we have to go back and forth to the server all the time. So this strategy, using that include, grabs all the data at once, only one query is made, and therefore ultimately ends up being more efficient. Now, if you only have 10 albums, not a big deal if you do separate queries. What if you have 10,000, right? Then not only are you pulling the data for the 10,000, but you're also moving all the data that requests it back and forth, and that's inefficient. So that's, and then you have to think about the modern web world. People want it to be fast and they want it to be responsive. Doesn't matter how much bandwidth and processing power we have. Efficiency is efficiency. And he makes a point that can actually add up to some significant problem. There's also some changes in the views folder. So if you notice now, we have a views folder created for Store Manager. And then notice that each one of the basic CRUD operations there also has its own CS/HTML page, right? That's pretty amazing too. And then you can dig into the code and take a look at each one. But basically it provides the user interface that allows you to do those operations. So whatever form elements are needed, or buttons, or checkbox, whatever it is, it made it for you. You don't have to build it. You can go in and CSS it a little bit and tweak it a little bit, but the bulk of the work, the heavy lifting, is already done. So we're on to page 91 now, and in that store manager, if you want to like actually, take a look at some of that code, he's pointing out the index CSHTML code, and he goes into the way that they're displaying the information. Now, I'm noticing that between the book and what I'm seeing in this file are two different things. So apparently, they've got like a little bit more of an efficient way of doing some of these things. No, and actually, really, it isn't different. It's just the way the TH tags are placed, so it actually is exactly the same. So never mind what I just said. That's called autocorrect, right? That's without editing the video. This is on the fly. But it pre-builds all these things. Notice the @ sign at the beginning. Once again, I'm not asking you to kind of like memorize this Razor syntax. It's just kind of created it for us. And what we're going to do is we're going to tweak it as we need. And I'm also realizing my headset microphone is about 2 feet away from my face right now, so I'm sorry that you guys weren't hearing me very clearly. Now you can hear me really clearly again. Sorry about that. Hopefully the auto level on my recorder helped to compensate. All right, moving on to page 92. Now he's going to start getting to this point where we're talking about the database and getting back to that question, Brian, and how this entity framework in combination with the MVC architecture actually can create a database for us. We didn't create a database. We didn't feed in any data, but we put together, through class files, mind you, a structure, okay, an implied structure. What this does is it actually will go in there and either create a connection, and that's the part that I'm looking at here in the book, if you're curious, right? And here's what it says. If you don't configure a specific database connection to use at runtime, in other words, you don't have one on a server, whether it's the same server or different server that you're connecting to, what does it do? Entity Framework creates one using a convention, right? And remember, the whole MVC thing is all about convention over configuration. So if you were to actually tie into a database, you would actually add into your web config file, like you do in a lot of other applications, right? If you've learned this in Java or what other language, you develop a connection string that you add into your code, and it's a string that gets used over and over. So anytime there's a database interaction, it just goes to this file, pulls it in, makes a connection, and it's kind of all transparent. Now, but the entity framework, it says once again here, if it can connect to the database server, that's great, but doesn't find a database, guess what it does? It creates a database on the fly for you. And how does it build it? It builds it automatically based upon the structure that you implied in those class files. Now, I'm wondering here if he's actually asking us, it says, if you run the application after scaffolding completes and navigate to this URL, you'll discover that it's created a database in local DB. In fact, I'm going to highlight this in my PDF, so next time I do this, I will see it very clearly. I didn't want to highlight the page stuff there, but whatever. So shall we try that? Let's try that. Let's live large. So I'm going to move this off to the side here, and I'm going to go ahead and run the application. Hopefully we get no errors, right? There's always that possibility. So far, so good. Let's see, Visual Studio's internal server is firing up. And I'm wondering what it's, okay, so there we go. So now you can see in the URL, and fortunately it came up right to that. It took us right to the index page. And of course we don't have any data in there yet, right? We didn't feed in any data. But it did create the columns, including names, I'm not sure what they're attached to, title, price, and album art URL. Now supposedly just by virtue of running this, it's created the database. So the thing that we're going to do now is we're actually going to close the application. and then try to find the database. Now he says here, you'll discover that Entity Framework has created a database named musicstore.models.musicstoredb in local DB. Find it for me. Tell me where it is. All right, so here's kind of the trick to this, if you didn't catch on. And I was quizzing my people here. I had paused the video for a moment because we had a web programming 2 class where we talk about some of the modern features of HTML5. And the application comes up, and we do want to run the store manager file here, right? And if you go into your inspect panel, of course we do it like this. One of the features of HTML5 is the fact that it has the capability of storing more data on your machine than older versions of HTML, which are basically limited to cookies, which had a very small amount of text you could store. But with HTML5, you actually have the capability to put in what we call local databases. And what I'm looking for here is where it's storing it, and it's not here, obviously, or under network. Maybe under application. And then we have the databases. And I'm trying to see if I can session storage. And maybe I'm being absolutely silly here, looking here, but I thought it would actually create it here in this particular spot, but I'm not seeing it. So maybe I'm just missing the boat here, but my assumption there was that it was creating it in this spot. So let's see if we can just pause for a moment and still find it. All right, so it's not storing it in the browser, but notice that if you actually stop your project from running first, because otherwise you can't get to this tab. You go to your Server Explorer tab under Data Connections. You can notice that we do have the Music Store database here, and we can actually go into the structure of it. If you right-click, you can actually go into these different views here. And this is where we actually see that local database view. If you guys are seeing that. And yes, you can actually treat this like a regular database. You can look at all the different views, the tables. You can actually open up the column. I mean, you can get into some pretty granular detail here. But once again, going back here and just taking a look, I think it's pretty fascinating that it's available in this fashion. All right, hopefully you've had a little bit of fun exploring that and just kind of seeing the capability that it actually went ahead and created that all for us, and how it was all automatic. So we started with code first, ran the scaffolding, it recognized all the relationships, built out all the tables. Of course, when we ran the application, of course, it didn't populate anything because we didn't feed it any data yet. But that's really part of the process here, ultimately. All right. If you do end up connecting this to a database that becomes external, and one of the things that you can actually do with your databases when you have something like this is you can actually detach it and pull it out and then actually put it into a database program or whatever. It does talk about using database initializers, in which case you would throw those into the global AX file, which is down here, and that is if you use that approach. Now that is important from the standpoint that if somebody's using your application all the time and it's web-based, that it allows the application to see if the database has changed, and if it has changed, to load the updated version. If it hasn't changed, it stays the same. So it's a script that you can run that helps to do that. Um, the next topic we need to talk about, and now we're down in the middle of page 95, is this concept called seeding. And the concept of seeding a database means that we might start with a code first approach like we just did, but then we actually need to get the data in there, right? And one way that you could do it, obviously, is you could run the application through a browser and then one by one type in all the data, right? Job for an intern, or maybe your first job out in the field coding. Or you can actually create files that you can use to feed the information directly into the application. So the example here in listing 4.7, once again, page 95, they're going to ask us to do exactly this. So what they're going to do is basically create another object inside of our models folder, and then we would actually feed it information just like this, and you can see that ultimately we run this thing called seed, which forces the information into the database that we've created. So all right, let's give this a shot. So let's go ahead. I'm going to highlight that code and move it off to the other screen here. So they want us to go to our models folder and do a right click and then add another class. So let's add the class. And they want us to call this Music Store DB Initializer. And make sure you spell that correctly because I already spelled it wrong. And I'm just double checking Music Store Initializer. Go ahead and click Add so you can see that there's the file. And then inside that folder, or inside that file, inside the class, we want to go ahead and add the code that's shown here. So I'm being really careful about this part of it. Now I'm going to copy all this code in, and I'm going to show you that I have a little bit of a conflict here, so I'm going to see how this executes. Because we do have this public class, right, which is the same one that I see in the book here, but you notice that it's got this extra stuff there. So I'm just highlighting all of that code, and I'm going to actually replace this class declaration here like so. Now hopefully I'm not getting anything underlining or flagging or anything like that. And I'm not seeing anything, so that means it's reading it just fine. So, and that's basically because I named everything exactly the same way that he did. So it's still called Music Store Initializer, but it is extending a system library which is pulling in, notice, the Music Store database. Right? Then he's going through and he's writing some code, and he's calling the method seed. And in there, he's doing artists, add new artist, Al Di Meola, add new genre, jazz, add an album. And then for the album, he's adding an artist called Rush and a genre called rock, and some information there. All right. Now, in order to get this to actually recognize and work, we have to actually add some code to that global ASAX file like we were talking about. And what we're going to do here is right in the application start method, and you're going to see this at the top of page 96, we need to add a line of code that looks just like this. And you are seeing some red underlines here at this point. And I guess I am a little concerned because it says the name database does not exist in the current context. Okay, that's not good. And then the second error, the namespace Music Store DB Initializer could not be found. Are you missing a directive or an assembly reference? Now wait, I just created that. What didn't I do? First of all, I didn't save it. right? Did that fix it? No. Maybe if we do a build, or actually let's do a rebuild, see if that clears up those errors. They're still there. Now the question is, he says in the instructions on page 96, if you restart the application and run it, navigate again to that same URL, you should see an entry in there. So let's actually go ahead and give that a shot and see if running it. Now my suspicion is it's not going to work, but I could be wrong. So let's go ahead and just give that a shot. All right. And my suspicions, of course, are correct, which makes me wonder, did we miss a step somewhere else? Now, we did have a directive back up on page 94. And the way that I read it, we didn't actually need to add that to the file because, okay, and let me just pull this back on the screen so you guys see this. And that's the one that I was talking about where it checks the initializer each time, just in case you have that database. But when I look at the file that he wants us to edit, so we created this, correct? And then we did this, which is a little different than what we saw in the previous thing, but it's not running, all right? And unfortunately, it wasn't voila, or like he says, or voila. It didn't work out quite that way. So we need to actually track this down and figure out the why and see if we can find some potential fixes. So here, I'm actually going to use the built-in tools, and I'm thinking that maybe it might be one of these where we are actually just not having the right libraries available, right? So that's actually a really simple thing to do. So I could either add the fully qualified name, right, which I think is what he was doing in the previous example. And you notice when I hover over that, you see how the code output on the right, and I know in the video that's probably hard to see, so this is probably one of those times where you want to full screen it. And then that code looks just like the code he had up above, right? So that's one thing, or I could try this approach. So I guess I'm probably going to err towards trying this one because it looks like what's in the book. You know, that's kind of my thinking. So I'm going to do this one, right? One error is fixed. Yay, right? That was the first one. Let's hover over the second one. Once again, this is why we use tools like Visual Studio. And it's not to really take place of doing our work. It's more to make sure that we're doing things that work. And so really what I'm seeing here is that all it's really doing is putting in the fully qualified names. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to Control-Z my last change, let it underline, and then I'm noticing that the library that it's kind of trying to pull in is the same library for both errors, right? Are you guys catching that? Show potential fixes. Or no, actually it's not. All right, so this one says using MVC Music Store models. All right, let's do that. This one says using system data entity. Let's do that. It's the same net effect as adding the fully qualified library name. That's why we do the libraries, so we don't have to type all that long, those long class structures. All right, save it. Be brave, hit run. Please work, right? That's what you're saying in the back of your head. That's what I'm saying. It's okay to say that. That's what makes coding fun, actually, is not knowing if it's really quite going to work or not. All right, and we do want to go to the store manager. I didn't launch from there, so that's why it's not bringing it up. But supposedly, if it worked right, hearing you guys being successful in the background? Yeah, yours is taking forever too? Okay. Okay. So now we're getting a different error. All right. And okay, so what I'm reading here is it's not actually pulling in the album data. That's what I'm seeing. It says 0 errors, 0 warnings. So I'm closing these extra windows here just so I can see. Oh, okay, so what's this saying? Cannot drop database because it's currently in use. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop the application, and I'm going to do a rebuild. Let's do that, because I didn't do that, did I? Remember I gave you that tip? You run into issues, that's one of the first things you should always try. All right, it looks like it succeeded. So I'm going to make sure that I'm on the Store Manager Controller page, launch from there, so hopefully it will go right to that page. Of course, it didn't. And really, you shouldn't have to have index in there because index should be implied. All right. So my gut feeling is here it's failing. Are you guys having the same effect? From what I can see on your screens, you're getting the same thing I am. All right. So, and it's bringing us right back to this. So, cannot drop database, music store, blah, 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 because it's currently in use. So it's trying to drop the database. I don't think that's a good thing. So my feeling on this is we need to go back and undo the changes we made to this file. And can I backtrack my way out of this? Can I Control Z this? Let's find out. It's letting me. Yep. Yeah, you got to stop your application first. That's absolutely. All right, so I'm looking at the other potential fixes here, and doing this I think is still probably a good idea. The other thing is that it doesn't seem to be recognizing the database, and you see like this option right here, it says generate local database. Should we try that one? All right. And of course, what it's doing is it's causing us other problems as a result. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and actually put in those libraries one more time, or at least for the Music Store initializer. And, I do have this approach that can go in there. I can use that approach, which I think we already tried. And my gut feeling is that we might actually need to do the last one. The question is that the right choice? So I'm actually going to pause the video to figure this out real quick. And I'm going to record this into the video, which I'm saying into the video right now, of course. The way I'm going to try to figure this out is I'm actually going to look at the author's source code to see which approach he used to fix it. So I'm actually going into our core shell, and I just mostly to show you guys where it is because I already have this downloaded and unzipped. But in the core shell, on the resources page, there is the textbook source code, which you can download and unzip, which I encourage you to do. So I'm going to pause the video again until I get to that code. Okay, so first of all, before I try your fix, Brian,
Yes.
right? Because I'm coming back into the video after a pause here, folks. One of my students, of course, Stack Overflow,
Yes.
of course, did a quick search, and he said that because we were messing around looking in the database, we actually opened up an active connection to it, and that's why we were getting that message, right? And now that message makes clear sense. So what he suggested that we do from the Stack Overflow thing is actually close the connection and then run the application. So what will happen then is then it recreates the database and gets it to work. Now I still have these build errors, so maybe I need to fix these problems first though, right? So let's go back with our original, just our using statements here. All right, let's save it all. I'm going to go back to Solution Explorer, right click, and rebuild. Not that I really think it's necessary at this point, but hey, why not? We can go back to Server Explorer, make sure that database connection is not active, and it's not. Let's go ahead and hit Start and bring up the application. And I don't mean to do this in a hurried fashion, but we are running out of time, so. We do want to go to the Store Manager page, / Store Manager, and voila. Thank you, Brian. I'm giving you kudos in the video. So, and that's the kind of thing that you run into, folks. So here I was going to look at the code solutions only to not find any differences, and then probably would have ended up where? Google, and then finding probably that solution, probably one of the first ones that came up. So probably a pretty common problem. So thank you. That really helped a lot. So folks, unfortunately we've run out of time tonight. It's time for us to call it a night. It's pushing 10 o'clock. So we made our way to the bottom of page 97. We were about to start the section on editing an album, and so we're going to come back to next week. So we'll continue chapter 4 next week on this section. So I know there's a few interesting challenges there, but that little trick that we had with closing that database connection seemed to be one of the keys, and I'm stopping my application. So if your database comes up here and it shows an active connection, it doesn't show a red X on it, you need to right-click it and close the connection, otherwise the application will try to basically reinitialize the database from the pre-existing each time. It's just a small little step, but we did have one student here in class that actually needed to shut down Visual Studio because, as you see with mine right now, it's not showing up, and that was what the trick to make it show up so we could close it and make it work. But that was the solution. So we're going to continue Chapter 4 next week. Good luck with your coding adventures, and we'll see you then.